All right, you guys. Just letting y'all know, I am a little jet lagged this morning. Not literally, but I helped MC and call an auction last night for UL men's basketball, and we've raised about $200,000 for their NIL. Just saying. That was fun, but I talked a lot and little slow. But once I get going, it'll come back. So I'm a little delirious. I'd have had to ask Mr. Shanefield regardless, so I'm not using that as an excuse, okay? Guys, the main part of this class for me is practical knowledge. Things that you can use, things that you can do and apply. So this first slide, before I bring Logan up to help me with our demonstration, is some examples of like when we're doing range of motion tests, we're checking flexibility, right? But a lot of times we don't think of specific muscles sometimes when we do these ranges of motion, or we're like, well, what's the range of motion in our wrist? And we don't take into account, well, are my fingers in this position or are my fingers in that position? Because that affects different muscles that cross multiple joints, right? So don't pay any attention to the verbiage because you guys know that me and my constant battle with the word hyperextension. All right. So, but look at the hip, okay? So flexion with knee bent is going to give you a different motion with flexion with knee extended. This class is to help us understand why that is. Like I think we know common sense wise you get more motion at your hip with your knee bent, but can we explain it? Can we see the whys? And so what we're looking at is who are the muscles that cross the hip? Gluteus maximus, semimembranosus, tendinosus, biceps femoris, long head. And you guys know what a limiting factor is? Like if you have 2 loaves of bread and you got 10 jars of peanut butter, but you only got enough jelly for 1 slice of bread, guess what? You got 1 peanut butter jelly sandwich. It doesn't matter how much bread and how much peanut butter you have. Your limiting factor ultimately is going to be how much of whatever you need is. So what I'm saying is that for these muscles, the limiting factor to your flexion of your hip when your knee is extended or your hamstrings. Though because they cross 2 joints, because they cross the knee and the hip, they will get tighter first because they're extended at both, they're lengthened at both ends, right? So the point of today's lecture is to put verbiage to concepts that I think we're familiar with, but we're going to put names and faces and application to it. So if I'm checking someone's hip flexibility and their knee is extended, really what I'm doing is I'm checking their flexibility of those hamstrings. The hip can flex more, but I got to remove the hamstrings as a limiting factor. So when you flex the knee, you put those muscles on slack at the knee. You shorten them at the knee. And then you can get more flexion. And more flexion is now going to test your gluteus maximus. So in other words, imagine if you were in a clinic and you knew you had to stretch the gluteus maximus for whatever reason. There's an injury or range of motion or whatever. You have to know that, well, to get to maximus, I got to take out my limiting factor. I got to get rid of the muscles that are going to stop my motion prematurely. Does that make sense? So I got to slack those extensors that cross the knee, and then I can get further into flexion to stretch the other extensors that do not cross the knee. Does that make sense? Okay. Very similar with hip. I think we mentioned it last class, but like if you were trying to stretch the rectus femoris and you wanted to isolate the stretch of the rectus femoris, we're going to flex our knee to make sure we lengthen at the knee and the hip. But if you slack it at the knee, you're going to be able to have a little bit more hip extension. You're going to be able to stretch or get to different muscles that are not affected by the knee position. Does that make sense? So on the test, we should be able to answer a question like this, like which muscle would have more of a stretch in the hip being flexed with the knee being flexed? Gluteus maximus would be able to get more of a stretch than you would when you have hip flexion and the knee is extended. Does that make sense? Because the hamstrings are going to stop your motion. It's no different. It's a different way of saying, if I keep my knee straight and I start anteriorly pelvic girdly rotating or flexing my hips, and I start to feel that stretch in my hamstrings, that stretch immediately goes away as soon as I bend my knees. And you know that. You immediately lose that stretch, even though you didn't move your hips. The reason you lost that stretch is because you slacked a hip pulling muscle at the knee, because it also pulls at the knee. So you do this, and you're like, I feel that stretch. You bend your knee, you immediately lose that stretch. Multi-articulating muscles that get affected at both joints, okay? All right, Logan, let's do our example today. What Logan's going to help me demonstrate is in stretching or doing range of motion examples. Logan, we're going to lay it face down on the table facing this way. So remember in 310, we talked about illusions, right? I can get my arm up higher by leaning my trunk. I doesn't have to mean my shoulder move, right? So what Logan's going to help me show you guys is when we're doing range of motion for our hip especially, and I want to test like his internal rotation, I want to look at his pelvis, because look how his pelvis can help his foot go further laterally by pelvic girdle rotating and moving at the trunk. So that's extra motion. So if I was testing Logan's passive range of motion, relax, 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 relax. As soon as that pelvis starts to lift off the table, I know that I've run out of real estate here, and he's just compensating by moving the pelvis over. So that's why some people will like stabilize the pelvis here and check range of motion. That's what they're doing. They're trying to prevent cheating from your range of motion. Okay, makes sense. And it would be the same this way, right? My father is so tight. Like I'm not very flexible, but my dad is so tight. As soon as I start rotating his hip, his pelvis is coming along for the ride. But if you're not aware of this, you may give credit. You may say, oh, that's normal internal rotation. You got to 45 degrees. If you're not aware that the person may be cheating or compensating in other places. Does that make sense? All right. You can feel the difference when your pelvis starts to cheat. So we naturally do that as humans. We cheat. You know, our bodies cheat movement because at the end of the day, if I say, hey, touch your toes, I mean, when you give functional tasks, bring your arm in, bring your leg in, bring your leg out, people are just going to make that happen. Here's another example. If anybody's ever worked in a clinic or if you've ever done shoulder rehab, one of the reasons we put, it's not necessarily a towel, but I'll use, me and my props. I'm so glad they left this for the week. I can use some of the props. Works in a clinic, we usually put a towel underneath the shoulder when we're doing rotator cuff stuff, or something underneath the shoulder. One of the reasons we do that, we'll roll up a little towel and put it underneath the shoulder. One of the reasons we do that is when we're doing rotation, think of it, if I'm externally rotating with a TheraBand that's trying to internally rotate me, in my mind, my hand just wants to go lateral, wants to go out, right? Well, I could get my hand out further if I abduct. Hand go out. So one of the reasons we put the towel is so that we don't do this, right? Keep it in so that the hand going in and out is just because of the rotation and not because of some secondary unwanted motion, okay? They'll say, well, it helps clear the humeral head. It's to help you not to cheat when you're trying to bring the TheraBand or the exercise out loud, okay? Our bodies cheat. That's what we do. And so we need to be aware of this. So let's do some other practical practices. So if we were going to test range of motion for our abductors and adductors, there's some different things we could do at the knee, right? So like if I wanted to, my gracilis might be a limiting factor to my hip adduction if my knee is extended. Flex the knee, put it on slack, maybe I get a little bit further adduction because now it's not my limiting factor. My point is that that happens sometimes. Imagine you're doing a range of motion test and they have very poor motion, but it's because of one muscle that might be tight. And so that is tools in your toolkit by understanding multi-articular muscles, how they pull, and how you can either increase or decrease their tension based on those rubber band-like properties. It can help you with manual muscle tests. It can help you checking range of motion, not just in one position of the joint you're looking at, but in putting other joints above and below at different positions to either lengthen or slacken muscles that cross into that area. That make sense? Okay. So let's do a couple practice questions, all right? How would we, and I asked this on Monday, but that's okay, we gotta learn the repetition. How would we optimally stretch our rectus femoris muscle? When I ask that question on the test, it's gonna be position. How would you want to position? So the first thing you would do is say, well, what does that muscle do? How does it pull? How does it pull? It's a hip flexion puller, and it's a knee extension puller. And that's straight in your nose. So we want to optimally stretch it. We want to extend the hip, but we also want to flex the knee. And you inherently know this. When you extend your hip and you flex your knee, it literally feels like that muscle's about to be ripped out of the anterior inferior iliac spine. Any questions before I go on to the next concept? So muscles that have multi-articular functions, let's go over just to make sure we're on the same page. Rectus femoris, hip and knee. Gracilis, hip and knee. Sartorius, hip and knee. Semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and biceps femoris long head, hip and knee. So if I ask the question, or I'm trying to, even though we've done these examples before, I'm trying to find different ways to act, or try to show you different ways I can ask it, right? So forgive my memory. What was the name of the exercise we did where like you do the thrust with the bar? Hip thrust. Thank you. Obviously, I've never done these before. I'm trying to find a good before and after. So another way I can ask, and again, obviously I have a before and after, but I can ask this a couple of different ways. I can say, I'll probably give you some information. Like this exercise, we're working hip muscles. We're fluctuating between hip flexion and hip extension. True statement. You obviously need to know, well, what's the exercise trying to do to my hips? It's trying to flex my hips. Does that make sense? If you relax all your muscles, you would cave in and you'd have hip flexion. True? So you don't need the hip flexion pullers. You don't need the hip flexors for this exercise. You need the hip extensors for this exercise. Who are the hip extensors? Gluteus maximus, membranosus, tendinosus, biceps femoris long head. And then the cherry on top is, which of those hip extensors would be working more than normal? Which one would you be emphasizing more of the work or isolating, however you want to call it? But in this exercise, you would be really emphasizing the gluteus maximus more because those other hamstrings are on slack at the knee. So another way I could ask it on the test is, which hip extensors or which muscles would have less of a contribution because of their length tension, because of their knee position? So you'd be like, well, the hamstrings would be lessening their contribution as hip extensors because they're slack, they're shortened at the knee. Does that make sense? See if I can get some force after practice. Tell you what, it may be easier for me to just demonstrate. All right, you guys, practice. Remember, before you go, or at least this is just the way I'm trying to teach you. When you're done with my class, you do it however you want to do it. But I think this process that we practice helps us to make sure we're identifying the right muscles because we understand why they need them. And then we say who are those muscles, right? So if I was doing some straight leg raise exercise, and I'm going to mix it up so that we can practice this, okay? Kelly Carson. All right. Don't go straight to the individual muscles. What's gravity trying to do to my hip? Abduct me. So I don't need abduction pullers or I slam my foot into the ground. Ow. I need adductors, adduction pullers, right? I need the adductor groups. Lucky for us, those are muscles that have adductor in their name. But remember, adductors are only named that way because they pull that way. You can have abduction because of adduction pullers, just like you can go down on an elevator. Like, that's kind of weird. An elevator lets you go down. Yeah, because the cable's still pulling up while it's letting you down. Right? So we identify the agonist. Those are our adductors. And then we just say, well, who are those muscles? Who pulls that way? And whether you do your list or whether you do your circles, these are the medial pulling muscles. Who are our adductor families? Our adductor brevis, longus, magnus, our gracilis. Did I give you the pectineus or no? It's kind of a little secondary one. So concentrically, I'm going to see adduction during this exercise. And eccentrically, it's going to be the abduction. Concentric, shortening while trying to shorten, making the motion happening in the opposite direction of the external force. Eccentric, letting it go back down, right? It's like if our elevator was an analogy of concentric and eccentric, elevator makes you elevate through concentric work, but the elevator lets you go down through eccentric work. But I could still work the same muscles holding this position. You know, let's say you ask your patient to just hold this position for 10 seconds. There's no motion, but I know those muscles are still working. You know why? Because I feel it. It's still the same muscles. Same muscles that made me come up, keeping me up, or letting me go down. It's the same muscles. So how did the same muscles influence different motion, different contractions? And that's what I'm hoping my students can understand, is not just to learn what concentric, eccentric, and isometric are from a definition standpoint. What does it mean? How do we apply it? How do we use it? Because that's really, really important for all of your different fields. Understanding the eccentrics and the concentrics and the isometrics. Okay. All right, how about this one? Flexors, extensors, abductors, adductors. Am I working? And don't answer it out loud. Just give it some thought and maybe put it down on paper or have an answer in your mind. Am I working flexion pullers, extension pullers, abduction pullers, adduction pullers? Okay, gravity in this exercise is trying to extend me. So I need flexion pullers, I need flexors, hip flexors. Who are those muscles? Well, those are the ones that cross my hip in the front. Right? Help me remember all of those. That's going to be like your iliopsoas, your rectus, your pectineus, your sartorius. Which one am I forgetting about? What's that? Ah, favorite muscle, the tensor fasciae lata. And you see, I think this is a good example. If we don't have kind of a process to identify, check those boxes, it's really hard to see a two-dimensional picture and remember all the different ones that cross a certain way. It's hard. So that's why I'm offering you different tools to help remind you of those muscles. How would my hip position? So if you think about it, if I'm here, I'm doing a fluctuation of flexion and extension, but my hip's already flexed. So like even going back a little bit makes a big difference because I'm lengthening hip flexors as I extend. I'm slacking hip flexors as I flex. Knee position could be important as well. You know, straight leg raise, but technically you can do these off of the table and have your knees flexed. There's no rule that says you can't if you want to alter contribution of different muscles, right? So being in this flexed position, I'm going to have all of my hip flexors are going to be kind of slack, but my rectus is going to be extra slack because my knee is extended right here, right? So if I really wanted to kind of get my rectus as a hip flexor, maybe I need to get off the ground and go on a table where I can have my knee flexed and then do some hip flexor exercises with a bent knee. To lengthen that muscle at the knee so it would pull more at the hip. In fact, that rectus, that's really, guys, functionally when it does its most important job, when you're sprinting and running, and you have all this momentum of hip extension, right, before you cycle through. So imagine you have this rectus that crosses the hip and crosses the knee. It's almost kind of like stopping the momentum of that whole segment at both ends so that you could change your direction and speed yourself up the other way. Kind of cool. So like a side, let's see. Let's do some, okay, that's creepy. Sometimes you never know what you're going to get. Let's do, I'm trying to avoid the horizontal. That'll be graduate school. Let's do something like this. Yoink. Yoink. Bless you. All right, you guys, let's figure it out. External force, trying to do agonistic group. Who are the muscles in the agonist? Let me reposition the camera so all of this makes sense in what I'm saying. Where would the concentric phase be? Where would the eccentric phase be? Remember, one of the confusions is that sometimes fitness people will say a movement singular, but really it's two movements, it's two motions for a whole repetition, right? Like to do a repetition on the bench, you got to make it go down and you got to make it go up. So it's really movements that contribute to that rep, not just one movement. So I think sometimes that's what contributes to some of this confusion, that there's a concentric phase or an eccentric phase to that entire repetition. Because think about it, if you just did one part, how are you going to get it back to do another rep? So we have to look at it holistically. We can't just look at any one part if you're going to do multiple repetitions. So I'm asking a question on purpose a different way. I'm not asking you to identify a concentric or eccentric. I'm asking which motions would line up with concentric or eccentric for this exercise. Does that make sense? So we should be able to identify our agonist. We should be able to identify the major muscles in that group. And we should be able to say, well, when I observe this hip motion, that has to be concentric. And when I observe that hip motion, that has to be eccentric. Those are all things that I feel a graduating kinesiology student should be able to identify. And I know we can. That's why I chopped this class into 3 main tests and a cumulative final, because I wanted to spend more time doing these practices, making sure we're all on the same page, right? Do I need abductors or adductors in this exercise? Good. Again, the reason I teach you this way is to understand I need certain muscles that pull in a certain direction of motion because I have something outside trying to make me move in another way. Abductors, because that exercise is trying to adduct me. Who are the abductors? So we got gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, my tensor fascia lata, buddy, piriformis, right? Now again, if you're a personal trainer or if you're working with athletes, it may not have to be like, all right, let's do the gluteus medius and minimus and tensor fascia lata and piriformis exercise. No. But if MRI comes back and says, hey, we have a problem with the piriformis, or we have a strain of the glute, knowing what those muscles do, knowing how to recruit those muscles. And again, as a practicing athletic trainer back in the day, there were sometimes our doctors would say, all right, for this condition, just start off doing isometrics, then just do concentrics, where literally we'd have to let the bar down for them so that they can just do the concentric part. And then there were times where it was, okay, now let's just emphasize the eccentrics. We had to know how to set those things up. Does that make sense? Where would be the eccentric phase? Would her leg be going down or would her leg be coming up? Good. What we don't want to do is always associate down with eccentrics. I mean, there's exercises where down could be concentric. Like if you were on a cable and you were doing like flies, right? Like down would be the concentric phase. So we don't always want to say, well, down must be or up. We don't want to assume. But in this case, yeah, adduction would be eccentrics, and the abduction would be concentrics. And holding this position for the picture would be isometric. Those muscles are working physiologically. So I love to teach through repetition. Some students find it boring because it's like, dude, you've said that 1,000 times, but that's okay. That just means you're going to understand it even more. When we talk about work for the muscle, it doesn't mean there has to be mechanical work. There's movement happening in those cells. There's motion happening in the factory of those muscles. There's enzymes a churning. There's an ATP a popping. There's movement happening, right? So we're talking about physiological work. So isometric work is not an oxymoron. You can't hold that position all day. The muscle is going to get tired and fatigue out because it's working above rest. That factory is pumping. That factory is moving. Okay. Any questions? Okay, let's do that clear enough? I think it's gonna, but make it work. Do your thing. The machine is trying to do. I personally do it by process of elimination. If the machine's trying to do something to me, I don't need those muscles that are also trying to do that same thing to me. I look at it as seeing who I don't need so that I can kind of prove what I do need. Once you identify the group that you do need, then you can try to identify those muscles that are in that group. And then we can try to apply once we identify our agonist, the muscles responsible doing a job to influence motion, then we can say, well, then these motions have to line up with these contractions. One thing I always say in 310, A, B, C, A plus B is equal to C, muscles influence motion through contractions. Our contractions are the last thing. It's kind of proven. If we know these muscles are working in an exercise, then we know if we see this motion, it has to be this contraction. Positive work, negative work. The muscles that are on are going to influence motion in their direction of pull through positive work, concentric contraction. Muscles that are on are going to influence motion in the opposite direction of their pull through negative work or eccentric contraction. All right, we need adductors. We just named them. When I see adduction, they have to be working concentrically. And when I see abduction during that phase, same muscles are going to be working eccentrically. Just to reemphasize, guys, and it's just such a common thing. There are some students who want to associate muscles with motion with no context. So there's some students that would say, oh, well, I must be working adductors when I see adduction and abductors when I see abduction. And that's what we're trying to avoid. You're working the same muscles in this exercise. That'd be like saying I'm working bicep when I come up and tricep when I'm coming down for a curl. No, you're working the same muscles the whole time. You know that. So why would it be any different for any other exercise that has a constant external force trying to constantly, in this case, abduct you? If those abductors turned on for any reason, you'd slam the weight back into the stack. That makes sense? So we're used to this kind of stuff. We're used to this kind of stuff, but it's taking that same knowledge and just applying it into ways that maybe we haven't applied it to before. All right, you guys, do me a favor. I know y'all don't want to do it. Stand up. Stand up for this next example. If you want to, I'm not gonna make you, but yeah, do it. All right, you guys, feet shoulder width apart. Is there any external force trying to rotate you transversely? No. So that means we have to make ourselves rotate transversely. In other words, muscles can only pull. I can't push myself into right or left transverse. I have to concentrically contract to speed myself up in right or left transverse. Eccentric in this case is going to happen when we got to slow ourselves down, putting on the brake, okay? But the gas is going to be concentric. Here's my question to you. Standing in anatomical position, feet shoulder width apart. Identify the muscles at the hip that sped up my right transverse pelvic girdle rotation. I'm going to help you because we haven't done this in a while. If I have right transverse, my right hip is going to have internal rotation. You guys remember that from 310? And my left hip is going to have external rotation. You remember that from 310? It's an illusion, internal, external. So I'm reminding you of this illusion. I have right transverse pelvic. I'm going to have right hip internal. I'm going to have left hip external. My question to you is, who are those muscles? So I'm giving you a bunch of information. I'm telling you the motions, and I'm telling you it's got to be concentric to speed it up. Now let's see if we can identify those agonists at those individual hips. Y'all can sit back down, unless you want to do it a couple of times. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page of what I'm asking you. Standing, you do right transverse. That's going to be right hip internal, left hip external. And I'm telling you, it's got to be concentric because nothing's trying to make you spin. You have to make yourself spin. So who would those agonistic muscles be as a group first, and then who are those muscles second? All right, guys? Right hip, internal or external rotators based off of all the information that I gave you? I gave you the motion, internal rotation. I gave you B, and I gave you C. I said we got to work concentrically. So can we reverse engineer and identify A? Does that make sense? ABC, muscles, motion, contraction. I gave you the motion and I gave you the contraction. So what does my agonist have to be on my right hip? My internal rotators. That makes sense? For my baseball and softball people, that's kind of important because your lead leg, when you swing, you're going to be using your internal rotators to generate pelvic girdle rotation. Your other leg kind of goes as a kickstand, so it kind of goes along for the ride, kind of make sure your bike doesn't fall over. In this example, internal rotators on my right hip, external rotators on my left hip, kind of working as a force couple to spin the basketball. So all we'd have to do is say, well, who are my internal rotators? Who are my external rotators? Remember, your circles are just right-sided because you don't have to be redundant. It's the same muscles. So even though it's your left hip external, those are the same muscles that are on the right side. So all you got to do is say, well, who are my external rotators? It's just they're going to be pulling on my left. So it's the same muscles. Does that make sense? If you're circling, it doesn't matter that I asked you to identify left hip. It's the same muscles on the right. It's a mirror. What speeds up must slow down. So during this time, we've talked about like concentric, eccentric from just nice, slow, and controlled exercises. But concentric and eccentric also happen in terms of gas and brake concepts when we're trying to move something really fast. Like in other words, if you were trying to do as many jumping jacks as you can, or if you were trying to run as fast as you can, you're going to have a constant fluctuation of speeding up flexion, slowing down flexion, speeding up extension, slowing down extension. Right? You can't go the other way until you slow down first. Easy example is if I'm doing shuffle drills and I'm running this way, I got to slow down my motion first here before I can speed up my motion there. Nothing happens instantaneously. So speeding up motion when there's no external forces or when you got to go faster than what the external force can offer is going to be concentric. But when it comes time to put on the brake, eccentric contraction is going to put on the brake. It's no different than how, like, if you bungee jump and gravity speeding you up, that TheraBand, that bungee cord is going to slow you down, put on the brake, and it's going to be stretched and it's going to be lengthened and the rope is going to be frayed. What I'm trying to do is emphasize why damage of all these tissues, all these rubber band properties happen when it's being lengthened. When it's being stretched is when the rope is going to fray. A rope never snaps when it's shortening. It's going to snap when it's being lengthened. The rubber band isn't going to pop when it's doing this. The rubber band is going to pop when it's being done that. Make sense? Let's see if we can identify some hip rotators. Ah, this is kind of all right, guys, let's identify, and always on the test, I'm gonna eliminate some things just to make sure we're all on the same page. We're not, all we're looking at is hip rotation in terms of a position or rotated position. So don't look at, well, I'm flexed a little bit or I'm extended a little bit. That could come into play for limp tension things. But right now, all I'm asking you to do is tell me, is she stretching right or left, internal or external rotators based on her hip rotation position, if that makes sense. That's the only question for now. For her right hip, are we stretching internal or external rotators? Don't answer it out loud, give it some time. On the right hip, are we stretching internal or external rotators? And we identify that based on, well, what's the position? If my hip is flexed, I'm stretching extensors. If my hip is extended, I'm stretching flexors. Same thing, but just in a rotation. And then look at the left hip. Look at her hip rotation position and see if we can identify what must be stretched. Just looking at rotation. Go. While you think about it, I want to reinforce through repetition. This stuff, if you just looked at it holistically, it could be very confusing. That's why I'm trying to offer a process. I'm trying to offer a process step by step so that these things can't be or don't have to be as confusing. If someone said, "What am I stretching here?" and only gave me 3 seconds, I'd be like, "Oh, I lose. I can't because human motion is so confusing. I have to break it down. We analyze motion joint by joint. We analyze agonist joint by joint. We analyze things joint by joint. If you see an etch-a-sketch doing loop-de-loops and the knobs are hidden, how do you know what in your mind you may think there's a, but they're individual knobs that contribute. There's no circle knob. It's a up-down working with a left-right. So we, as analyzers of human motion, have to look at all these joints as individual knobs that are contributing to all of these loop-de-loop functional tasks in motion. But the wrist can only do so many things. The elbow can only do so many things. The hip can only do so many things. Is her right hip internally or externally rotated? Externally rotated. Good. So if it's externally rotated, I have to be stretching internal rotation pullers. You remember that was one of our 310 illusions, where for our shoulder, internal, my hand comes in, but that's because my elbow, when I flex, my hand goes forward. When my knee flexes, my lower leg goes out. So this is internal and this is external. external, internal. Okay? So her right hip is positioned externally, so therefore she'd be stretching internal rotators. And your circles just help you to remember who they are. Your lists help you to remember who they are. Her left hip, and again, that darn foot is tempting, but her left hip is internally rotated. Internally rotated. Externally rotated, internally rotated. So her left hip, we'd be stretching external rotators. If I were going to ask a rotation stretch question, I would literally funnel it down to just say, I don't care about any of this other stuff. What's the position of the hip transversely? And what group would stretch because of it? No different than saying, I flex my hip, I stretch my extensors, I extend my hip, I stretch my flexors, I abduct my hip, I stretch my adductors, I adduct my hip, I stretch my abductors. It's the same thing, just applied maybe in a way we're not used to applying. Rotation, that's all it is. But it's the same concept, because all your skeletal muscles have to follow the same principles. They all pull. And they don't push. I think one of the things I keep saying in 310, if muscles could pull and push, we would need half of the muscles that we have in our body. Because my bicep could do this and it could push me into that. That's not how muscles work. They only pull. Is this boring or useful? Awesome, awesome. I juggle the fine line of boring and useful. So I just want to try to make sure that we're being useful. On Friday, we'll start into our knee lecture. I'll be happy to post like an old knee lecture in case you guys want to get a head start on it. But I'm going to post the Moodle materials. I'm going to post the PowerPoint. Get a head start. You know what's cool? Relative note. The knee should be, you already know some of these muscles. Rectus is going to function at the knee. Our hamstring is going to function at the knee. Sartorius, gracilis. So it really shouldn't be that much new stuff. It's kind of cool. All right. Have a good one.